Privyet, Krakodak Army. The last month or so has really been a trip down memory lane for me, but it's not a trip I ever wanted to take. Suddenly I feel like we're in the Cold War again after Vladimir Putin took over Crimea, a region of Ukraine. I may need to give some background about what happened, because as soon as Crimea was taken, a Boeing 777 plane disappeared, and yes, that's a big story, but if the relative amount of coverage is to be believed, a missing plane is somehow 10 times more important than Russia taking a chunk of Ukraine and then moving tens of thousands of troops to the other border areas with Ukraine. Geopolitics can be complicated, though, and news outlets could make a missing plane story a lot more relatable, even though it pales in importance to Russia's territorial ambitions. And this is coming from someone who had just flown on a 777 2 days before Flight 370 disappeared. The former president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, was voted out of power by the Ukrainian legislature after violently putting down anti-government protests last month. Yanukovych was Putin's man in Kiev, and he supported Russia's annexation of Crimea. On Friday, he said that other regions of Ukraine should also hold votes on joining Russia, knowing that a few other eastern provinces might also go to Russia if that actually did happen. Agitating for his country to give away land to its already much larger and more powerful neighbor should tell you all you need to know about where his loyalties are. I'm actually sympathetic to people being able to decide where they belong, and I don't doubt that a majority of Crimeans did want to become part of Russia, but that concept has its limits. When Russia took over Crimea, they took over all the military installations and hardware, the entire Ukrainian naval presence in the region, and every other piece of infrastructure, with no compensation to Ukraine, all at the barrel of a gun and with a wave of propaganda that went unchallenged, including telling Crimeans that the new leaders of Ukraine were neo-Nazis, on giant billboards no less. Of course, who would ever believe Russian propaganda, aside from Russians? Actually, a lot of conservative Americans would. Some of you wonder why I keep some conservative friends who hold views that I find so awful. It's partly because I would never believe stories about how conservatives think otherwise, and in this case I never would have believed that so many of them would be so pro-Putin. They crowed about how cool it was that Putin had outmaneuvered Obama, as if Obama had any other options that would have stopped him besides open military conflict. They talked about how Putin was so pro-Christian compared to Obama. They also love his masculinity, riding on horseback with his shirt off, the consummate outdoorsman. Now, I'm not going to sit here as someone who makes his living as more or less a data nerd and give people lectures on traditional masculinity, but the Putin version of masculinity has a lot less power since they discovered gunpowder, and I don't understand how it's impressive to anyone anymore. They apparently think a former KGB head who has untold blood on his hands has systematically crushed dissent in his own country and is now threatening his neighbors through intimidation and brute force is a model for Christianity. If Putin is doing what Jesus would do, what does that say about their religion? In the years before and after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia's neighbors like Poland, Hungary, and others immediately strengthened their ties with the United States, and some of these countries joined NATO. This is something that has always upset the more hawkish Russians like Putin, but this should hardly be surprising. When a country has dominated you by force for almost 50 years, and you see an opportunity to get out of their orbit, you make friends with a country who has the power to stop you from being taken over again. Many countries took the opportunity to do that, but Ukraine did not, thinking that Russia would never invade them, so nobody was obligated or in a position to give Ukraine aid in time. Putin used the defense of Russian-speaking people to justify taking over Crimea, and has been rattling his saber at the rest of Ukraine as well as Estonia. What makes that more scary is that Estonia is a NATO country, and the rest of the NATO countries are obligated to intervene for Estonia if they're attacked. Now, I don't think he would cross that line. Then again, I don't know where Putin's line is anymore. If that line is crossed, a protracted ugly conflict with Russia fighting the US and Europe would likely ensue, and that's assuming it does not go nuclear, which I assume would be unthinkable for all parties. I've been talking about Putin specifically here because he of course does not represent the views of every Russian. I don't want to give anyone the impression they should suddenly start distrusting their Russian friends because of Russian government policies. I must point out though that Putin is very popular right now in Russia, and feeling powerful and relevant as a country seems pretty important to the average Russian, though some of that may be driven by propaganda and a complete destruction of any media voices of dissent by Putin. Either way, any potential armed conflict between nuclear powers is an issue that merits more of your attention. Or are you still too worried about that missing plane?